Hey guys. I thought I would go over a few things one more time before tomorrow. We are going to have a quiz on the classification and taxonomy stuff that we've talked about already. And so let's go through things one more time just to make sure you know everything. And I'm going to show you some stuff that you need to memorize for the quiz tomorrow. So we began this unit by talking about classification, and that is just a generic word that means grouping things based on similarities. It can apply to absolutely anything from shoes to music to animals. And we talked about a guy named Aristotle, who was one of the first ones that came up with a logical classification system. Now, notice he didn't have the bacteria and the protists on his list. Can you guess why? He probably couldn't see them. There were no microscopes back then, and there are even very few protists that are actually visible in water without a microscope or some kind of stain to make them stand out. So he probably didn't know they were there. We talked about the weaknesses of his system. We talked about how modern classification has put all living stuff into 5 large kingdoms, and then as you watched another video later, you saw it's actually a little bit more complex than that because there's something bigger than kingdom called domain as well that separates out the 2 types of bacterial life from everything else. And then we looked at the 7 steps, or 8 steps if you're talking about domain as well, of the modern classification system. And this is the thing that you'll need to have memorized for the quiz, but it's not as hard as you think. You don't have to have the whole thing memorized. I'll show you how to keep one little thing in your head that'll help you remember the order of things. But if you look at the way we've organized living things into categories, it starts out with very large groups up here. This is showing the categorization for a human and an ostrich. And you'll notice they're both in the same domain. That's because they're not like a bacteria. If they were like a extremophile type of bacteria or a regular bacteria, they would be in a prokarya category right here. But since we're both multicellular and we have cell parts, we're in the domain eukarya. We're eukaryotes. Now, as you go on down the list, the terms get more and more specific about the animal that you're talking about. As you get all the way down to species, then you're dealing with a group of animals that can only interbreed with themselves. In other words, an ostrich can only mate with and have babies with another ostrich. They can't mate with a duck because that's another species. And that's the definition of species: interbreeding animals or plants, something that can produce offspring with each other. So you could even take a cardinal, a redbird, and a bluebird. They're both birds, but they're 2 different species. They will not mate together and have babies. So if you think about it like this, if we were looking at the plant kingdom, right, and we were talking about the kingdom Plantae, and remember, these are all in Latin, so they're going to sound funny, but you don't have to understand Latin, okay? You'll never be held responsible for understanding those words. But in the kingdom plants, you've got all the plants, but notice that animals are already excluded from this list. Bacteria are already excluded. The fungus are not there. It's just the plants. And as you go on down the list, you get into the angiosperm phylum, which means only the flowering plants. And then as you drop down to class, you're in the dicot class, which means they have 2 seed leaves. And then as you get down to order, we're in the roses family, the roses families, I should say, in order. And then as you get down to family, you're in the rose family. And then as you get down to genus, you're just talking about one little group of roses within the rose family. And when you get down to species, you're only talking about one type of rose. And there are many types of roses. So that rose will only interbreed and have offspring with itself. Now, plants are weird, so sometimes they can break that rule. It gets a little squirrely, but as a general rule, right? So if we look back at this classification of humans and ostriches, you'll notice that they match up all the way down through phylum. They are both animals. They both have a backbone, right? A spinal cord, chordata. But when we get down to class, they separate. We're mammals, right? We have hair, and they are aves. They're birds. They have feathers. And then as you go on down the list, you find out that humans are primates, which means we have opposable thumbs like chimpanzees and orangutans. And then we're in the Hominidae family. And then our genus is Homo and our species is Sapien. Now, those last two words, you'll notice that on both of them, they are in italics. And there's a reason for that. That is the naming system. Now, taxonomy is the science of categorizing things together and naming them, right? And one guy that gave us our modern naming systems, his name was Carolus Linnaeus. He came up with that system called binomial nomenclature. Now, binomial nomenclature is the technical term. Binomial, two-part nomenclature, name, two-part names. You almost never hear anybody say that in scientific circles. We just call them scientific names. And they're called that because it got so confusing. You take this little sparrow, for example. We call it a house sparrow. But in Spain, they call it the gorrion. In Holland, they call it the musch. And in Sweden, they call it the husparv. I'm probably mispronouncing all of those really badly. Also, in England, they have a bird they call the house sparrow. But it's not the same one we call a house sparrow. We call it the English sparrow. And if you ask English people what an English sparrow is, they don't even know because they don't call it that over there. So you've got all these common names for something, but that got really, really confusing. And Carolus Linnaeus said, look, that's enough. We've got to come up with a single scientific name for each species that everybody agrees on, no matter whether they're working in Japan or Germany or America. So he comes up with this two-part naming system that consists of their genus and their species name, kind of like the last and first names that we give people. When there weren't many people in the village and somebody asked for the blacksmith, you could just say, oh, just go see John. It's John over on the other side of town. But when there's 20,000 people in town and there might be 25 Johns, you can't just do that. Because there might be a John who's a carpenter and a John who's a blacksmith and a John who's a tailor. And so we started using last names, surnames. And in the beginning, it was usually either where you were from or what you did. So they would say John the carpenter or John the smith or John the tailor. And those got shortened down to just John Taylor, John Smith, John Carpenter, right? First and last names. And that made a difference between people. Eventually, we started giving people middle names because there might have been a lot of John Smiths there too. But his system only contains two names, and it's the genus and the species name. So if we go back to this slide, you can see that the last two in the list are the genus and the species name. So our scientific name is Homo sapien, and the ostrich's scientific name is Struthio camellus. It's always the last two, genus and then species. And you notice that species is not capitalized. I found out the hard way when I wrote a 15-page paper. This is back when there was typewriters, guys. You couldn't correct. I wrote a 15-page paper and turned it in for one of my science classes. The professor looked at it for 2 seconds and said, species is not capitalized, and handed me back 15 pages that I had to retype. So I told you that you had to memorize these, not the Latin words over here on the right-hand side, but the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The state wants you to know those in order, but there's an easy way to remember it. You don't necessarily have to keep in your head kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species if you just remember this little mnemonic device. King Philip came over for green spinach. King Philip came over for green spinach. If you keep that in your head, then when, like if somebody shows you the third from the bottom here, right, and says, what is that? Is that the order or the class or the phylum or the family? Then you'll easily be able to count down. And if they have domain in there too, if there's 8 steps, then you can remember dumb King Philip came over for green spinach, right? But usually they just do kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So if they show you this one and they say, what is that? But they don't have these words over here. Well, you can just count down. King Philip came over for is family. So that would be family. So that's how I remember them. King Philip came over for green spinach. It's a good way to keep them in your head. Now, with the naming system, they will usually show you the name of something and ask you which one is genus and which one is the species. Or they'll show you an entire list like this, and they'll say, based on the 7 steps in its classification, what is its scientific name? And all you have to remember is the first word's the genus and the second word's the species. It's always going to be the last 2 in the list. So if we look at this line here, to find the scientific name, we could ignore all this other stuff that is telling us that it's an animal, it has a backbone, it's a mammal that eats meat, it's in the cat family. But the only ones you need to pay attention to are the last 2 here. It is Panthera leo. It's in the panther genus, and its species name is Leo. Leo the lion, right? Makes sense. All right, I'm leaving you some stuff to study for tomorrow, some flashcards that you can use to quiz yourself. So memorize those things, study up for the quiz tomorrow, and you should ace it. All right, good luck.